welcome to the deep dive.
Right.
Okay, for our mission today, I need you to really step back in time, like way back. 8 centuries. Close your eyes for a second, picture this. It's 1250 AD, Western Europe. You find yourself standing inside one of those immense medieval cathedrals. Above you, there's this vaulted ceiling, right? Took generations to build. It just sort of vanishes up into the gloom. The air is thick, heavy with incense, damp stone, that consecrated smell. Stone arches rise up like, I don't know, petrified ribs of some giant beast. And it's quiet, except it's this faint, distant chant maybe, and this rhythmic sound, a scraping, sacking on cold stone.
Right, that scraping sound. Well, that's the sound of a life, a nameless life. It's the sound of who we're focusing on today. A young boy servant. He's probably no older than 10. His small frame, I mean, it's just utterly dwarfed by the sheer imposing grandeur all around him. His whole existence is sort of the flip side to the church's towering ambition.
Right, that's the image, that intense contrast. And that's our mission for this deep dive. We're digging into historical sources, looking at the lives of children, basically given over to service in the medieval church, this massive, powerful institution. We're exploring that stark difference, between the sacred veneer the church showed the world.
The holiness of the ritual.
Exactly. And then the harsh reality hidden away as a suffering, the servitude, the exploitation happening right under that surface in the cold corridors down in the crypts.
Yeah, and what's really striking, I think, is how the official histories, they focus so much on the big names, right? Popes, kings, saints, the powerful figures. But our sources today, they force us to look down, to see these forgotten stories, the unrecorded lives, survival, sacrifice, these small, invisible people who were actually the bedrock, the foundation for that whole massive structure, political, economic, spiritual.
Okay, so to really understand the boy, we first need to understand the world that basically consumed him. Let's unpack the church's power back then, mid-13th century. So, setting the scene, 1250 AD, that cathedral, it wasn't just a church, was it? It was a statement, a physical display of supreme power. The sources describe it almost like a mountain, a monument to God's grandeur, but also to the church's might, spires scraping the sky, casting these long shadows over the town below.
Oh, absolutely. It was designed that way, to inspire awe, sure, but also devotion and submission. And if you zoom out, look at the bigger picture of the church in 1250. It was arguably the single wealthiest, most formidable institution in Europe, full stop. Its influence wasn't just, everywhere. It was often absolute.
We talk about the spiritual side a lot, but we sometimes forget just how vast its physical footprint was. Its economic power. It wasn't just guiding souls. It was like a state within states.
Precisely. That's crucial. We have to see the church not just as religious, but as this dominant economic engine. Think about tithes that mandated 1/10 of everyone's income or produce, plus huge donations, generations of land acquisition. The church owned vast amounts of land, more than many kings or feudal lords in certain areas, an unrivaled landholder.
So when the sources say it rivaled kings in power, how real was that rivalry in 1250?
Oh, very real. We're only about, 50 years past Pope Innocent III, the height of papal power, really. This meant the church set moral codes, ran its own courts, ecclesiastical courts, which could sometimes override royal justice, and they held the power of excommunication. For a king, that was basically a political death sentence. So, sheer weight of its economic clout, its political authority. That cathedral wasn't just a beacon of faith. It was like a local fortress of control, dominating life for everyone, peasants, townfolk, everyone.
And it's into the arms of this immense, powerful, controlling institution that our boy servant and so many others like him were delivered. Which brings us right to this grim idea that sources call the transaction, poverty and piety.
Yeah, and this is where you really confront the desperation involved. We're talking children being relinquished, sold sometimes, or just given away by parents crushed by hunger, by hardship. Medieval life was brutal for the poor. If you had too many mouths to feed, handing a child over to the church, it might have felt like the only way for anyone to survive. The child, the rest of the family.
And the church naturally framed this as an act of piety, charity even.
Of course. It was presented as this double-edged promise, wasn't it? On one hand, a beacon of hope. The child gets food, shelter, and crucially, salvation. A guaranteed spiritual future. The sources always paint this exchange as holy, virtuous, a sacrifice for God.
Hang on, if the parents literally had no other option, can we really call it piety? Or was it just coercion dressed up in religious robes?
That's the core question, isn't it? The sources push us there. The transaction was cloaked in piety, absolutely, but shadowed by exploitation, because the church had this This insatiable need for servants, not just the choir boys for the fancy liturgies, but cleaners, cooks, bell ringers, kids to do the endless grunt work of maintaining these massive buildings.
It just needed bodies, young bodies, cheap labor.
Exactly. So the institution became a kind of repository for these children, exchanged in a bargain where, holiness often didn't protect them from the harsh realities at all. The parents make this agonizing choice, trusting in the church's divine mission, hoping for compassion. But that trust, well, it was often misplaced. The child was just absorbed into a life of unending service and usually profound silence.
So the boy's journey wasn't really about choice or aspiration. It was about stark economic necessity.
Yes.
Forces way beyond his control pushed him there.
Right. So he's inside the walls. What's life actually like? It's a world away from the stained glass and the incense. It's defined by this relentless, regimented routine demanding menial labor, day in, day out.
Yeah, the sources are clear. His day started long before the first church bell. We're talking hours before dawn, pitch black, probably freezing cold inside that stone building. What kind of tasks are we actually talking about? What filled his days? Oh, just brutal stuff for a kid. Imagine being 10, trying to navigate this huge dark space, sweeping vast stone floors slick with wax drippings, maybe lamp oil, mud tracked in, constant cleaning, hauling heavy buckets of water, probably from an outside well, lugging them inside to wash altars, clean the sacristy, and then the candles and lamps. Hundreds of them, maybe. Lighting them, trimming wicks, extinguishing them carefully, keeping the place lit for all the services, the daily offices. The physical strain alone. On a small kid, likely not well fed, in an unheated building year-round, that cold just seeps into the descriptions.
It's a crucial detail, that cold. It was constant. And all this work, it's done under this unwavering watch. The sources really emphasize the clergy's faces stern, rarely softening. Their commands weren't requests, they were sharp orders, cutting through the quiet like sharpened blades, as one source puts it. There was zero time for play, zero tolerance for mistakes. And the threat of punishment, it was just woven into everything he did.
Which really cements his place in that rigid hierarchy. He wasn't just low down, he was rock bottom. The invisible labor keeping the whole thing running.
Absolutely. His value, measured purely by obedience. Total, unquestioning obedience. He was basically dehumanized, reduced to a mere instrument of service. Any individuality. Sacrificed. Crushed under the weight of discipline. And remember the theology here, the idea of original sin was strong. Children needed correction, constant discipline to purge that sinfulness. So in their minds, discipline wasn't cruelty. It was a necessary, even pious act to save the child's soul.
Sounds like a system built for total submission. Psychological, physical.
It was. Discipline was harsh, unyielding. Any slip-up, spill some water, leave a smudge on a cloth, hesitate too long, swift rebuke. Often physical. He would have learned incredibly quickly that survival meant submission. Total submission. That lesson gets etched into you, not just by words, but by that constant awareness. You're disposable.
And yet all this is happening surrounded by overwhelming beauty. The scale of the cathedral itself, what did that do to him psychologically?
Well, it was profoundly isolating. Think about it. All that massive architecture, the soaring arches, the frescoes showing saints or scenes of judgment, the intricate carvings, it was all designed to make powerful people feel small before God. But for the boy, that grandeur just amplified his own smallness, his insignificance, his vulnerability. He's constantly reminded of how frail he is in this huge, echoing space.
Like a ghost in his own home.
That's a good way to put it. A ghost among saints and angels, as one text says. Completely invisible to the worshippers coming in for comfort or salvation, and yet utterly essential to the whole operation, the unseen foundation for every grand ritual. His world was the cold corridors, the shadowy chapels, alone, always moving, but never really seen as a person. His voice, his existence, just swallowed by the stone, the silence, the shadows.
That gap, that emotional distance between the boy and the grandeur he's serving, it brings us right back to the economics, doesn't it?
Yeah.
The sources really stress that the cathedral's splendor, its power, its very function, it was built on the backs of kids like him, their labor, their sacrifice.
That's the hidden truth, the uncomfortable part we have to face. His very presence was this silent, living proof of the church's complicated, often hypocritical relationship with wealth. This institution wasn't just built on faith, it was built on the unpaid, back-breaking toil of children whose names are lost, deliberately forgotten maybe, buried under layers of dust and liturgy. His life was spent serving an institution that valued power, order, its own preservation, often above basic compassion.
And he saw this contrast every single day. The visual disparity, you'd see the top clergy in their, incredibly rich vestments, gold thread, imported silks, using golden chalices, maybe gem-encrusted, for these very public, elaborate rituals.
It's such a stark image, isn't it? The glittering ceremony versus his reality. He's dressed in rough, threadbare wool or sacking, ill-fitting, probably dirty from his work, and his endless, exhausting labor done in the shadows is what funded the very spectacle he was preparing and cleaning up after. This wasn't some accident. It was fundamental to the system. It reinforced the hierarchy, hammered home his low status constantly.
Okay, so we talked about how the promise of education was often the hook, getting kids from desperate families. But what about the reality, this mirage of education, as the sources call it? How did that actually work for a boy servant?
Mirage is exactly the right word. The promise was huge education, was the way out of poverty, right? But it was meted out sparingly and selectively. That's the key phrase. Maybe some specialized boys, like choristers with real musical talent, they might get some structured lessons, Latin, maybe some music theory, basic sums, the trivium, perhaps. But most servants, like our boy, totally illiterate.
So if he's mostly cleaning, fetching, doing manual stuff, his potential was just ignored. He got just enough training to be useful, but nothing more.
Precisely. His days were just consumed by physical work, his education, limited to prayers he had to memorize by rote, and learning the specific mechanical tasks for the services. The vast knowledge the medieval church held the libraries, the scholarship completely walled off from him. That promise of spiritual growth, intellectual development, totally overshadowed by the practical need for his labor. His mind, likely eager and young, found almost nothing to feed on, which, of course, kept him trapped in his station.
And the combined weight of all this, the contrast, the denied potential, the endless work, led to this relentless erosion of childhood. What do the sources tell us about the psychological cost? How did it feel for him?
It's genuinely heart-wrenching to read. His childhood, any sense of lightness or play, it just slipped away, like sand through his fingers. Memories of family, if he had any clear ones, the cottage door, the smell of smoke, maybe his mother's face. They became these fragile secrets, barely holding on against the exhaustion and the grimness of his life.
Forced into a maturity he wasn't ready for.
Absolutely. The kind of carefree laughter you expect from a kid, gone. Replaced by this wary vigilance, fear, necessity. That's what shaped him. Hope wasn't something he could just feel. It was a whispered secret. Freedom. A distant dream he probably wouldn't even dare to voice. He learned how to survive, yes, but the cost was immense. His innocence, his identity, ground down day by day.
Okay, now we need to delve into the really dark side, the suffering that was systemic, hidden behind that impressive facade. We have to talk about the cruelty of authority that seems baked into this system.
Well, let's look at how they justified it, right? For the clergy involved, that line between correction and outright cruelty could blur with alarming ease, as the source puts it, because they genuinely believed, or told themselves they believed, they were saving the child's soul by disciplining the body. Their actions felt like, well, pious duties, not abuse. They had spiritual authority, and sometimes they wielded it like a weapon, pure domination.
And this wasn't just harsh words, it meant physical abuse. The sources are unfortunately quite specific.
Yes, arbitrary punishments, often sudden. We're talking about painful discipline. Being struck hard on the hands with a ruler or a piece of wood, or receiving harsh lashes from rods for being too slow or making a mistake. This wasn't about teaching a lesson in the way we'd think of it. It was about pain enforcing absolute submission.
And unlike the grand public masses, this abuse was kept hidden, deliberately.
Crucially, yes. The sheer size of the cathedral offered cover. These punishments happened in private. Secluded rooms, dark corners of the sacristy, places where a cry wouldn't carry or would just be lost in the building's echoes. The clergy had to maintain that facade of holiness to the outside world, so the abuse stayed hidden. And for the boy, speaking out was unimaginable. It would just mean worse punishment, or maybe being thrown out entirely back to starvation.
Beyond the physical beatings, there was this constant verbal assault, the emotional and psychological torment.
Yeah, that was relentless. Corrosive. Any mistake he made, maybe just from being tired or young, was magnified. He'd be mocked for being poor, for his low status, constantly reminded, you're a servant, nothing more. And kids internalize that stuff. It chips away at your sense of self-worth until there's almost nothing left.
And this environment, it didn't exactly encourage camaraderie among the servants either, did it?
No, it fostered deep mistrust. So the isolation just got worse. Even if he was around other kids, that loneliness was profound because real friendship was risky. It was fragile. The sources mention how vulnerability could be exploited, maybe by an older servant trying to gain favor, or just someone trying to shift blame onto the smallest kid. So he learned to hide everything, not just bruises, but his feelings too, behind this guarded, empty look.
In all of this, the pressure, the fear, the emotional damage, it resulted in what the sources call a forced maturity.
It's a brutal kind of maturity, though, unnatural. That line between being a child and being a servant, it just completely disappeared. He had to develop this hard shell just to function, a kind of cynical toughness way beyond his years. His body might be small, but it moved with this weariness, this constant fatigue.
So the invisible wounds, the damage to his spirit, his sense of self, those were the heaviest things he carried.
Absolutely. More than the physical aches and pains, those invisible wounds replaced everything that should have been there. Curiosity, joy, innocence. It all got swapped out for this guarded emptiness. His identity got fractured, reduced just to his function within the church machine. He learned early and cruelly that his needs, his pain, his very being didn't matter nearly as much as the demands of the institution. It was survival, yes, but it cost him his essence.
But even after hearing all that, the sources do give us something else, a glimpse of the human spirit, not being entirely crushed. Even in this state, the boy seems to have held on to some kind of resistance. Not open rebellion, obviously, but a subtle, quiet rebellion against the despair.
Yes, and this is maybe the most moving part, I think. The small ways he managed to assert his humanity, despite everything. It wasn't loud, but it was there. These little hidden acts that kept some part of him alive.
The first one mentioned is secret prayer, seeking comfort in faith, but maybe not in the way the church dictated.
Exactly. His personal faith somehow existed outside the institution that held him captive. We're talking about prayers whispered when no one could hear, often made up on the spot, from the heart, just desperate pleas for strength or maybe a moment of peace, trying to connect with a God that felt kinder than the men supposedly representing him. These were tiny affirmations of his own spirit, bypassing the church's control completely. A private link to something sacred, reminding him he was more than just a servant.
And despite the risks you mentioned, the mistrust, he still managed to find some fleeting connections with other servants.
Yeah, these were like little lifelines, absolutely vital for staying sane, probably. A quick shared glance, acknowledging how awful a task was. A whispered word or two, maybe just sharing names, or a tiny joke about a priest. These moments were incredibly brief, always risky, but they were real connections, small bonds forged in the silence and shadows. They defied the system's attempt to totally isolate him, offered just a flicker of human warmth in that cold, rigid world.
And here's something really interesting. The very grandeur of the church, the thing meant to intimidate and control him, sometimes became a refuge, finding sanctuary in art and music.
Right. The cathedral was his prison, yes, but parts of it became his escape hatch, too. The sources suggest he'd linger, maybe while cleaning, looking at the details, intricate carvings telling saints' stories, vivid frescoes showing Bible scenes. In those images, he could find beauty, mystery, maybe even a different kind of possibility, worlds away from his daily grind. He could lose himself for a moment in those stories, perhaps imagine a world where sacrifice actually led to something good, not just more exhaustion.
And the music. In a place like that, it must have been powerful.
Oh, overwhelming. The choir music, the organ. The sources call it a language beyond words. For him, it must have offered this temporary lift, a moment where the sheer weight of his life eased slightly. When that music swelled, filling the space, it could just wash over him. He could pause, hidden in a shadow, and let the harmony maybe reaffirm the promise of the place, even if the reality was so brutal. It connected him to the divine idea, if not the human execution.
So the very tools the church used for devotion, he quietly repurposed for his own resilience. And through all this, somehow, he had hold of the persistence of dreams.
Yeah, these silent visions, maybe just flashes of sunlight, remembering open fields, imagining laughter without fear. These dreams were incredibly fragile, easily crushed by the next harsh word or punishing task. But they persisted. That persistence itself was a quiet rebellion against despair. A silent statement that, despite everything they'd taken, they hadn't taken his ability to imagine something else, something better.
So in the end, maybe his biggest act of defiance was simply enduring it all.
I think that's right. His endurance is defiance. That's key. His spirit was battered, definitely burdened, often aching, but it wasn't completely broken. That resilience, however quiet, is this profound testament to our human ability to just keep going, to hold on to some sense of self, even when hope feels impossibly far away. It's that refusal to just give up entirely that sustained him.
But we have to turn now to the end of this story. As the sources show, even the strongest spirit can eventually be worn down by relentless hardship. That fragile resilience started to falter. We see the onset of decline.
Yeah, illness was almost inevitable, wasn't it? It crept in quietly, a much more dangerous enemy than any angry priest. Think about it. The constant damp cold from the stone floors, the chronic exhaustion, poor nutrition leading to malnutrition, the constant risk of infection. Fevers would leave him shivering. Coughs probably racked his small body, especially in the cold nights. The level of labor demanded was simply unsustainable for a growing child. His body just started to give out.
And the institution's response. It's shocking. The church, with all its resources, its supposed spiritual mission,
Yeah.
it offered no real help, no sanctuary when he got sick, just indifference in the face of suffering.
To the people in charge, he was just a servant, a tool that was breaking down. His pain, his suffering, it was like a faint noise, easily lost amidst the chanting and the important rituals. He wasn't seen as a child needing care. He was seen as weak, maybe even a nuisance, a liability now because he couldn't perform his duties efficiently. His utility was gone, and so apparently was his humanity in their eyes.
All the wealth surrounding him, the gold chalices, the rich vestments, maybe even monks who knew some medicine, none of it trickled down to help the most vulnerable, which led to neglect and isolation.
Exactly. Medical care for someone like him, rudimentary, if it existed at all. The infirmary, if they even had one for servants, was likely just another cold, damp room, maybe even unsanitary, a place where the sick were just left. So his illness just made his isolation worse, compounding the physical pain with this terrible emotional realization. He was completely alone. That huge cathedral, once just isolating, now became a true prison, trapping him in his suffering. The church's concern was for the souls of the powerful, it seems, not the bodies of the powerless who serve them.
And so, inevitably, his short life reached its quiet, unmarked end.
His last breath. The sources describe it as just a faint ripple in the vast river of time flowing through that place. His death went completely unnoticed by the worshippers arriving for Mass, just feet away perhaps, overshadowed by the grandeur, the incense, the bells, his body. Probably just left in some cold, forgotten corner, a storeroom maybe? Certainly not near the sacred altars or the revered relics, just put aside.
Was there any kind of service, any acknowledgement at all?
Absolutely none, according to the sources. No prayer said over him, no procession, nothing. His absence created no gap that wasn't immediately filled. The next poor child would be brought in from some village, and the machine would keep running. His death was just this silent, final testament to the countless lives like his, sacrificed, used up to maintain the church's power and glory.
His story just vanished into the unrecorded history, the deliberate silence surrounding the powerless.
Yes, his life, his death, completely overshadowed by the grand narratives. The stories of kings, popes, saints, those were recorded, celebrated. His story, it's like a hidden thread in that tapestry, essential to its structure, but completely invisible. And it challenges those comfortable stories, doesn't it? The narratives of glory and salvation the church promoted, it forces us to remember that behind every great monument, every powerful institution, there are often these unacknowledged sacrifices. Pain that's been silenced by history, by authority, by tradition. Their suffering literally paved the way for the stone monuments. Hashtag how tracked down.
So the boy's life, even though we don't know his name, it gives us this incredibly stark, essential way to look back at that era. His experience, caught at that brutal crossroads of faith, immense power, and grinding poverty, it really stands for the hidden human cost beneath the foundations of these huge, imposing institutions, doesn't it?
It really does. And his struggle, it forces us, I think, to look beyond the official records, beyond the deeds of the famous and powerful. We have to actively look for and try to acknowledge the quiet endurance of the powerless. Because those small acts of resistance, we talked about the secret prayers, the fleeting hopes, they tell us so much about the resilience of the human spirit, even when it's being systematically crushed.
It's an incredibly powerful story, even in its anonymity. A story that history tried very hard to just erase, to keep silent within those stone walls.
And that leaves us, and you listening, with a pretty challenging thought, I think. The boy's death, his silence, it kind of pushes us to listen harder, to try and catch that faint echo that still lingers in the vast quiet of places like that cathedral. A whisper of all the lives whose unnoticed labor, whose hidden suffering, actually built and gave meaning to those monuments of faith. So the question becomes, what other stories, just as vital, just as obscured by grandeur and power, are still out there, waiting for us to finally acknowledge them?